If I can resize this a little bit.
Is that it?
Yep, that
Hey,
is it.
thank you everyone for attending, taking time out of your schedule to attend a Fremont session with one of the many research activities we're conducting. Anna Keelan Associates. I'm Keelan, and then Keith Carl is on here as well. And we're having a listening session to get your input in regards to what you feel the current and future housing needs are of the community. That's what we're here to talk about. I'm going to talk about a few things, but then we want to hear from the audience and get your input in regards to what that current and future housing need is. But the listening sessions are part of the process, as well as we've conducted 2 different surveys, one for major employers to get their take on housing in the communities, as well as one for housing stakeholders, both public and private venture stakeholders in housing, be they realtors or builders or nonprofit groups, whatever the case may be. And we're not going to go over the results of those tonight, but what we're going to talk about here just for a couple of minutes is I want to talk about the projected or kind of preliminary, let's call it preliminary housing demand. If I could get Keith to pop that table up. Here we go. This is the preliminary estimated housing target. There's 3 different pieces here: housing target, potential, and economic development boost demand for housing throughout the county. It's a countywide housing study with a 5-year projection of what that need is going to be. And we tie this together with the input that we get from listening sessions, as well as surveys and a variety of input we get from the steering committee, our housing steering committee as well, and come up with some reasonable assumptions of what that demand number should be. Let's talk about Fremont here and talk about first and foremost their target population, their target projection for housing. The target number over the next, and I can go in detail as to how we make this determination, but we juggle a lot of statistics dealing with new households, the projection of housing for persons that are cost burdened, about your vacancy deficiency, and so on and so forth. So we look at a variety of different components, statistical components, to arrive at what we feel is a reasonable assumption of what that preliminary estimated housing demand is. But for Fremont, we have on the low side, we have a housing target demand of 317 owner and 281 rental units for a total of around 600 units over the next 5 years. The potential associated with it, which is kind of that central point of what the housing demand is in parentheses there, where we show 706 owner units and 511 rental units for a total of around 1,200 units over the next 5 years. Fremont Economic Development Boost, which gets into a discussion about the creation of new business opportunities, the expansion of local industry, the addition of local industry, and has something specifically to do with population and household increase, is the higher number of the 3, where we have 892 owner and around 700 or 697, around 700 units of rental units, and for a total of around 1,600 units. So how we look at this is we kind of try to set up when we do our housing studies in communities, to set up sort of a range of housing demand. And the range that I would look at for Fremont specifically, what I would look at is kind of a floor of the potential number and then a ceiling of the ED boost number. So potentially for rental units, for example, you would need anywhere from around 511 rental units over the next 5 years, additional rental units, and around about 511 to around 697 rental units, and around 706 owner to around close to 900 owner units. So for purpose of our discussion this afternoon, late afternoon, I just thought I'd sort of open it up and talk about where we're at as it relates to this preliminary housing demand for, we have the countywide, as you can see up above there, but specifically talking about Fremont this afternoon. So again, what we do is we look at, over the next 5 years, estimated population and household growth. We look at the anticipation of trying to serve some households which are cost burdened. We look at 10% of the households which are currently cost burdened, both owner and renter. We also calculate the replacement of an estimated 20% of occupied housing stock, which is deteriorated and dilapidated, to assist those families that are living in substandard housing. We also take a look at increasing your vacancy deficiency. A community like Fremont needs a vacant deficiency of around 7% to provide for enough market for opportunity of choice and to attract new business and to allow for the expansion of business. Anywhere from actually about 7 to 8%. But that's not all one type of housing. That's different price points and different types of housing, both owner and renter. Currently, you're probably about 3% or less for vacant units in the community. And we also take in consideration what we call a pent-up demand. And this is the demand for housing over the next 5 years for those folks that currently live in the community that may want something else or need something else, specifically those which are not spending that much money for housing. We find that there's a high percentage of households and communities that are only spending maybe 10 to 15% of their income for housing. And this takes into the consideration for them to get involved more economically in more expensive housing and more housing opportunities for themselves. So that's kind of how we look at this. And we also take in consideration, as we go through the study process, of not only new construction, but the concept of purchase and rehab and resell and re-rent existing units. And that could be up to 20 to 30% of the target demand or the potential or the ED demand. You're going to need to take a look at refurbishing or repurposing existing housing units in the community. So if you can roll down, I think just for a second, Keith, to the bottom of that table. Yeah, here again, you know, the floor, as I look at it, is probably around the 1,200 units with the ceiling. You can see note 1 and 2, with the ceiling more at around 1,600 units. So that's our comment. And we also, on the bottom, we also take in consideration workforce housing units. And the workforce housing units we have there are tied to the target demand up there. So if we take a look at the ED demand or the demand potential, those workforce housing units would increase. So that's kind of where we're at in this process. We're about 2/3 through the housing study, finish up here in the next 6 weeks or so. We've had the opportunity to meet with Cedar Bluffs is involved in this process. And so they had a meeting last night, as well as North Bend. And a little later on, you have one in Scribner. So we're getting a lot of good input countywide in regards to what the housing demand is. Now, you've had a lot of activity since we did the last housing study. And from my calculations, you know, you've created quite a bit of housing from that study. Plus, you still have a lot of housing study in the pipeline, or housing projects in the pipeline. And currently you have close to around 997 rental units in the pipeline, which would, you know, more than substantially take care of what's needed for the ED boost of around 700. Now, it's not to say that all these units will come, you know, will actually occur, you know. I mean, there's different reasons. Building housing is difficult. You have to find land, you have to get approval from the city on this and that, and you have to find financing. And so these different projects to make up the 997 are at different stages of development, and some of them soon to start construction. But still, I'm really pleased that you have that kind of response by developers, people who know how to do housing, that kind of response from the last housing study itself. So Fremont's doing a really good job recruiting developers and trying to meet the needs of those developers as it relates to getting housing stuck in the ground. So anyway, So now we want to hear from you folks. You know, what do you feel are the current housing needs, as well as the future housing needs over the next, in type, we're talking types of housing, be it for families, seniors, renter, owner, special needs type of housing, whatever the case may be, and what that need is for the future over the next, for the next 5 years. So, Kelly, I'll kind of turn it over to you to sort of call on people or something like that. Or Gary, you can start if you like. That'd be great. Hello. You still on, Keith?
Yeah, I'm just muted real quick. Kelly, whoever you've got there that has any comments or anything, we'd like to open it up to you folks. Gary, you can chime in as well on some of the thoughts of kind of what you've been doing as it relates to housing, where your shortfalls still exist, and how we can try to pinpoint what the vision is for the city of Fremont as it relates to housing over the next 5 years. So, Gary, if you have any comments, or Kelly, or anybody in the audience, you folks as well, now's your time to take advantage of it.
Can you take that down, Keith, and kind of show everybody's face, so to speak?
Yeah.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So I basically think that this is a good start for us in Fremont, but I think some of the pain points, we'd love to hear your thoughts on more of the affordable workforce housing needs. How do we dig deeper into those pieces a little bit more, Tim and Keith, as well as I know we'll get to that point, but there's been a lot of questions about, well, how do we ramp up our programming to support rehab and other things like that. So any thoughts you might have on that would be great.
Well, it all comes down to organization. You know that, Gary. It's like, your first step is to have the housing study. The housing study will include some very specific goals and housing development initiatives. And then it will also include a 5-year housing action plan, and which to identify that process of implementation. At Hannah Keelan, we try to concentrate on implementation. We put all these numbers together and come up with reasonable assumptions about this and that. In this particular case, it's housing. But we really concentrate all the time thinking about implementation. And what's going to be really important is that once the study is completed and approved and accepted by the county and each one of the communities, what's really going to be important are the local housing stakeholders and getting them organized underneath one umbrella, putting together what we call community housing partnerships, putting this group with that group to do a particular project, this group with this group and that group to do another particular project. And that can include both public and private partnerships. So the organization of that is what's really going to be important. And some communities are very successful at that. Some kind of struggle at that. You can't just wait for the housing developer to arrive at your doorstep. You've got to encourage them. You have to have particular housing initiatives, development initiatives, and do the type of projects that you want to do. In the case of workforce housing, it's going to be important that the partnership include those major employers, in my opinion. We're seeing more and more of that in communities. The major employers are partnering with a housing developer, be it the hospital with a housing developer, be it a manufacturer with a housing developer, getting involved directly, making a commitment for housing for a certain percentage of their employees. That's changed. 15 years ago, that wasn't the case. You just couldn't get major employers to listen to you when you try to preach that. But today is different, and very progressive major employers are thinking outside the box and thinking, if they want to secure and keep good employees, they need to provide as one of those benefits the opportunity to purchase or the opportunity to rent, an acceptable type of unit. So, and we'll crunch all the numbers and kind of, at the meeting next week, we'll have numbers as it relates to kind of what those price points are for different workforce categories and so on and so forth. But partnerships, community housing partnerships are extremely important. We call them CHIPs, they're community housing partnerships, and they're made up of housing stakeholders. Government's going to play a role. They always do. There's probably 100 times more dollars out there today than there were 15 years ago. Different tools of public intervention, like the tax increment financing, the LB 840. The legislature was very kind to housing this year, repacking the bucket with more dollars as it relates to workforce housing. There's been an adjustment in the Nebraska Community Redevelopment Law to allow for smaller TIF projects for housing. Just a number of things. And I know Gary's familiar and is up to date on these different pieces of legislation that passed. There's the land bank deal that's gone through, that piece of legislation, which is going to allow for communities to bank land and make it available on a request by proposal to developers and so on and so forth. So anyway, it's a long answer I gave you, but it all comes down to hard work and partnerships to do the housing. That's the world according to Tim anyway, Gary.
Tim, I'm gonna ask another question. This is probably tied to sites for future development. What is your feeling based on what you've seen so far in Fremont as to whether or not we're growing in the appropriate areas tied to our comprehensive plan, or what are some of the things we need to be prepared for in the future as we start to branch out with all of these projects? So if you could touch on that just a little bit.
Well, when we do a calculation of what we think, the estimated demand or demand potential or the economic development demand is, economic development boost demand is for communities, we make a projection of what that housing, what kind of land is going to be needed for new construction. 20 to 30% of these units are going to be sort of a rehab type of process, in my opinion, because they're affordable that way. They're more affordable to the lower income and things is one of the reasons. Plus you want to use some of your existing resources, such as houses and so on and so forth, obviously for to provide for new housing types into the future. But we also make an estimate. Next week, I've made some preliminary estimates on housing requirements. Here's how much land is going to be needed. And I haven't got to the point yet as to where to fit that number into what's available in the community, but we're working on that. Jennifer and I still need to get together and talk about land usage, and because of what's going on over the last 3 months or so, it's just, we haven't been able to do that, but we're going to do that. But, you could be required to have, close to maybe, a requirement of close to 300 acres of land availability to allow for, what that housing demand is. And then try to fit that into the growth areas that you're most interested in. Last night at North Bend, we got to talking about that. And I asked the city council person who was talking about where to put housing to meet with their planning commission and basically mock up a future land use map and send it to me. And Keith and I will work on that and, and actually put it together in the right kind of format and stuff. So when the city goes through its planning process for its comprehensive plan, they're going to have to be, that planner will have to be very cognizant of the fact that there's going to be X amount of acres needed for new housing. You don't want to be short on land. And we see a lot of communities that are short on land. They don't have it planned for in their comprehensive plan, and you don't want that. So if I kind of touched on that a little bit.
So there looks to be, there's a comment from Joy, and maybe you or Keith might want to touch on this. Or Joy, did you want to chime in and say something? It looks like she's, so I'll just drop out. She can.
It doesn't matter to me. Yeah, I just made a comment that we have, I'm with Habitat for Humanity, so we see a lot of families that are living in very poor conditions. And so we see a need for very affordable housing, whatever that is, if it's row houses or small homes, whatever would be affordable for people to get into someplace decent to live. So that's just my comment.
Well, and the other thing too is, and the steering committee is going to have to talk about this next week too. And Kelly and I will put this on the agenda. We need to start thinking about, you know, what's been the effect of this COVID-19 on people's economics as it relates to being able to make their house payments or their rent payments and things. And I don't have the answer to that. And we've got to like kind of dig deeper, like on the local level to kind of make some kind of reasonable assumption of what kind of a hit that's been on families and their affordability. So that's another issue above and beyond, which also takes in consideration those which suffered economically from too much water a year ago. So there's a number of issues there that need to be addressed, and it just kind of keeps popping the numbers up as it relates to that percentage of units that need to be of lower income, you know, for lower income families and things. Good question, or good comments, so I appreciate that. Other questions, comments? You're muted, I think.
Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, from the people that are available as part of the presentation, I just saw the camera went out. Yeah, Gary, I noticed you had a comment. Okay. For those of you at the presentation itself,
I think that it seems like oversight that there's not just like the lower class people that we're needing affordable housing for with the new developments over by Linden Elementary and stuff, and the people that get Habitat homes and things like that. Like my husband and I are trying to buy a house in this town, and it is impossible to find something. And he's a salaried position, and he makes about what two like beginning, you know, employees, like say two starting teachers would make. And we can't compete for a house. The houses that we get, if we don't get in to look at one in the first 2 hours, we don't stand a chance, and we can't stand a counteroffer, and we have money saved up and things like that. It's just, that's something that I think needs to be addressed, not necessarily. And we've looked at the houses over in Gallery 23, the townhomes, and the two like homes that they have built out there to show, like that's not affordable. This new development at Sunridge and the houses down on Luther, like that, I don't know who decided that that's affordable housing, but it's not affordable. Our budget is 150 to 200,000, and that's not abnormal. That's why all of the houses in our price range are flying, because there's nothing that people can afford. And we're tired of having to pay rent to crap landlords that aren't maintaining the property. And it's frustrating because we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. We're stuck between wanting to afford something and trying to save enough money to better our lives and to make something that we can give to our children and a better home. And you really can't find a balance in Fremont, and it's frustrating. It's frustrating. Like I like Fremont as a community and a place to raise my family, but it's hard to find a decent place to live here. You either pay $1,200, $1,300 for a house to rent that your landlord may or may not take care of, or you can try to buy a house and pay that much, but it doesn't really matter because you can't afford to buy one anyways, because landlords are buying them all so they can turn around and flip a profit and not take care of it. Or you have people that can afford to buy a house. It's just, I don't know. I've been knee deep in small children, and so I haven't been able to follow this along as well as I would have liked. But I think that that's something that needs to be addressed. It's not just low income people. It's not people that are homeless. Like, I've been there. My kids and my son and I were at the homeless shelter, and we've come a long ways in the last 6 years, but it's not just them. It's not just those people that need an affordable place to be with, you know, Section 8 housing and things like that. It is people with kids that are taking care of their houses that would love to have a home to take care of that just can't afford it. And there needs to be something done. Whether we look at, you know, I don't know what that entails. Maybe making it so you can build in bigger yards, doing like mother-in-law suites, making that easier to do, or you know what, but there's gotta be a solution. And I think that that's something that the community, the city government needs to address. On that note, I'm gonna clean up my kids' mess real quick.
I really appreciate your comments, and this is something that's occurring in, you know, communities like Fremont, where, you know, it's just rapid growth and it's a popular place to live. People want to live there, they want to work there, and this isn't uncommon. You know, we're seeing the same thing like in Grand Island and Kearney and Hastings and those communities as well. You know, we can't build new housing typically, you know, for a family, 3 bedrooms and plus, that sort of thing. It's very difficult to get those built for, you know, less than about $275. And so what we need, and I mentioned earlier, and it's not necessarily the most profitable venture, but we need to get a housing initiative, which addresses the purchase of these homes by some organization, some nonprofit group, to purchase homes or have homes donated to them and to do the proper rehabilitation and sell those. The other side of the coin is, I don't know where your husband works, but I think earlier I mentioned, you know, major employers need to be involved. Major employers, you know, if I was perhaps your husband's boss, I would be very interested in what you just said, because, you know, we don't want to lose him as an employee. And so it's like, how can major employers work with their employees to get them in some reasonable good housing, or get them in good housing, get that whole thing stabilized, so they can save some money and buy a new home at 300 or 275 or 300 sometime down the line. So your comments are well taken. I really appreciate it. And you're not in a boat by yourself on that. And we hear a lot of that type of thing. And it's just being competitive to buy. And that's frustrating. And it's that I'm in Lincoln, Nebraska. It's the same way. And, you know, things are listed and they sell for more than what they're listed for. And some of it's not that good a housing, but I appreciate your comments. Gary, maybe you like to make a comment on that.
Am I good to go? Okay. You guys can hear me? Okay. Yeah, I think those are definitely comments that we want to hear, and so we appreciate that perspective. I think we want to make sure that everyone is aware of the targets in the study, just the previous and the study, which it does focus on a full range. And so what I would consider, you know, workforce housing or affordable housing, I usually consider that meaning the whole range that Tim and Keith have looked at. And I think every study or the last study that we did actually highlighted that we needed every level of housing. And so although people may have heard workforce housing as a target or affordable housing, I think we mean that for everyone. So I think the goal, though, is that we're in this place where we are in this growth period. And so a lot of that is going to be a slow process as to moving people up into other homes and expanding the housing base as well, and getting rid of some of the dilapidated housing and some of the homes that or apartment complexes that are not being maintained. And so I think as we add more product to Fremont and Dodge County, the better things will get. When we're at this critical point where there's just not a lot of housing options, then that's that example you just gave, that happens a lot because of that. And so our goal is to make sure that there's more senior housing, more single family housing, all of those options, because then it does become easier for you. So I think your points are well taken, and we'll continue to push to make it possible with programming as well. So.
Are you able to reiterate? I don't really want to get on camera, but I have.
She wants me to repeat what she's saying. I don't have your name, so Jamie wants me to repeat what she is going to comment here.
So we went and spoke with the people out at Gallery 23 and buying a lot and like the minimum square footage on those.
Okay.
Is there, they say that it's
So
too expensive to build a house.
So Jamie,
For less than like a 250-ish price range. Is there a way like
to get,
make that affordable? Because
so I just want to make sure they're caught up because they can't hear anything, so it might be just silence for them. So Jamie's looked at Gallery 23 and the lots that are available there, and you said the price point that they gave you was
like there's minimum square footage that you have
minimum
to put
square
on,
footage. Yeah.
and then the cost of to build a home
Mhm.
is not like
It was two. What was
it
the
was
rate?
about like 240, 250.
240 to 250 to build the house, which is pretty much what you're going to see across the board. And you're saying, are there options to make it
Yeah,
cheaper?
is there a way to make like, is it, and I don't know if it's because Habitat just the simple like workforce concept.
Right, habitat
Cost.
was one question.
I've got a comment.
Yeah, sure. So Tim, if you want to give any thoughts there, I think we have. Okay, so I'm going to be cut out here. Go ahead, Kelly.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, this is Jennifer. I just want to point out that some developments and like Gallery 23 have covenants that restrict the size of housing that can go on lots. The city's zoning regulations, which we will be updating, but our current zoning regulations do not have a minimum house size. We do allow accessory dwelling units, and I instituted a change a little over a year ago so that all of the small lots throughout the city and the small houses become conforming lots. And so if one of those small houses on a small lot that doesn't meet the minimum size requirements in the zoning ordinance, they can be rebuilt. What? Oh, okay. So anyway, I just wanted to point out some of the things that we've done in our zoning code to try and make sure that there are opportunities. I'll get out of the way.
Well, I want to add something, Gary. All right. Okay. I want to add something. And I said it earlier. But if you have no land, you have no house to build on. You know, it's like, that's just the nature of it. I'm hoping that Fremont really jumps on, as well as some of the other communities in the county, jumps on this opportunity for land banking. And, you know, what I would like to see is a partnership in the community that could secure some dollars from foundations, let's say $300,000, $400,000, and get out there and be competitive to buy older houses and take them out, knock them down, and make those lots available, or to buy open land, you know, maybe perhaps buy a couple lots in a new, you know, 3 or 4 lots in one of the new subdivisions. That's the only way we're going to be able to make sure that we get folks like, you know, the young lady who spoke earlier, get those folks in housing which fits for them, fits their dollar, fits, you know, their family size, that sort of thing. So we've got to have land. We've got to be competitive for land and competitive for old houses that are dilapidated. And because these folks who buy properties that come available, these landlords, you know, they've got they've got the resources available, the dollars available. They've got the credit advancements available from local lenders and so on and so forth, that they can, they can get in there and get something bought right away. And that's very difficult for a young family to compete with, to be quite honest with you. And we do live in America, which, that's it's sort of the capital way to do things. I mean, that's just the nature of our country. But we've got to find a way for that sort of missing middle, that group that can't compete, to be able to compete and get a piece of land. And if we have an organization that can that can pick up 5 or 6 lots in a new subdivision, maybe a major employer buy those lots, give the money to an organization to buy those lots, get those lots secured, and then make those available, for folks to build houses on, and buy down the cost of that house. So instead of it being $275,000, it's $190,000, that kind of thing. And that makes it competitive. But that's a whole different housing initiative that has to be seriously looked at. Doing housing in Fremont is a full-time job, to be quite honest with you. And, we're going to recommend that, that you have the kind of staffing that's necessary to do that. I mean, you just can't walk around with a housing study. We can't just have you walk around with a housing study, preaching housing needs and demand and that sort of thing. There has to be that key component of implementation, a serious key component of implementation. And that's what we're going to propose. And it's going to include these partnerships of major employers with nonprofit organizations and things, like Habitat and so on and so forth. So we can get some lots built, get some lots secured for families that can't afford a $300,000 house, but could afford maybe a $200,000 house, and get the cost bought down on that. So that's going to be real important. Land's going to be very important. And I don't know, and I could ask Jennifer, I don't know how much land the city currently owns, in regards to buildable lots. Do you know, Jennifer, offhand, or? Jennifer still with me? Is Jennifer still with us? Jennifer? Anyway, a lot of times the municipality.
Tim,
Yeah.
What we know, and Jennifer's right here, so she doesn't have access to speak unless she walks over. We have a lot of industrial land, and by a lot, I mean we have more than 1 or 2 lots, but as far as what might be residential that is owned by the city, nothing. But I will say this, some of your comments make it possible that we can move to developing what we have with the Dodge County Investment Fund, where we have that $2 million that's revolving right now. And at some point that money will be open for us to utilize to help support developments like Jamie mentioned, or purchasing lots, or helping with habitat and things like that. But right now it has to go through its cycle, which is tied to the workforce housing projects. But that's money that the state hopefully won't ask back for, and we raise some of that money using what Tim mentioned, some of the business owners and nonprofits contributing. So if we build on that, we have an investment group, we have Kelly and several others in the housing realm. So Tim, I think you're right. Let's build on that. Maybe there is an additional staff person that we should look at adding and making this more of a focus. So I think you have another question from a local public resident. So I'm gonna be quiet.
Is there a way, like, I know that you guys said that Fremont, you don't think owns very much residential land or land to be built on as far as residential housing. Is there a way to look and see how much housing is just sitting vacant that's empty? Because if you could enforce like this can't sit longer than however long, like if a bank owns it because it's been in foreclosure, it needs to be sold off so it can be repurchased and flipped, or repurchased, like if you could buy it for cheap, then you could have people that could afford to buy a crap residence and fix it to make, you know what I mean? Like, especially in the older area, I feel like we've looked at houses over there and some of them look like they have not been lived in. Like, is that something, I think that's something that Fremont should maybe look into.
I can respond to that a little bit.
Okay.
In the housing study,
There's
we
not tons.
try to make, through field work and working with the county assessor. This is an important issue that she raises. What kind of supply, what kind of resources just sitting out there that people don't understand what's going on with it, I mean, it could belong to an elderly person who may be in a nursing home right now, for example. It could be, and it's just sitting vacant and, but there again, that's kind of another housing initiative to get out there and find out, who owns these properties. And you'll find out every once in a while that somebody in San Diego owns it or whatever the case may be. But important, we'll make a reasonable assumption in the housing study of how many of these units are actually out there. And they're considered like non-available units is what they're kind of considered because they're just setting. And I think the city, as your governing entity can put a little pressure on some of those property owners that own that housing and either get that stuff sold. We see some of those absentee owners donating those properties to nonprofits for a tax write-off. That's a whole nother initiative you need to look at but I appreciate you raising that issue. What kind of resource, what kind of housing stock is just sitting out there that nobody kind of really knows what the story is behind it? There's a lot of that.
So we had this conversation in Cedar Bluffs, Keith and I did, and I'm sure you guys had a brief chat about it in North Bend, but most recently the land bank bill was passed. And so while it doesn't give carte blanche to just do anything, it does allow for what Jamie was asking about, potential lots that can be purchased or taken over and then developed or flipped and sold as bare ground. I think it moves us in that direction, but it'll have to be a collaboration of multiple communities. And then those communities will have to work with a nonprofit or a development district or some contractor to work through that process. Now that's a sticky process. Tim and Keith could probably speak to how that goes when you have absentee owners and people who have tax issues, those things. It could take a long time to get through the legal process for that. So I think there's a lot of different ways to do this, and we're going to have to just try to continue to push in the right direction. And this is good work that we can do. I mean, we've started with the housing study with the help of Tim and Keith, Hannah Keelan in 2017, and look at all of the things that you all put in that study, recommendations that have come to fruition. So it looks tough right now, but Tim, I feel as though you guys are going to give us some great recommendations that we're going to come together and we're going to be able to knock out some of these goals.
And one of the things I'll add to that also, Gary, you brought up a good point about, the vacancy rate in the community. Some of the preliminary information that we're looking at as it relates to housing that's strictly on the market for sale or for rent, and stuff that's up to code and basically livable or suitable for habitation. Preliminarily, we're looking at about 3.2% vacancy rate for the city of Fremont, which is still significantly low to the 6 to 7%. But on top of that, I looked at the 2017 study, and your vacancy rate there was 2.6%. So you've gone from 2.6 up to 3.2. So that even though it's only been since 2017, there's at least been progress made in terms of getting housing units in the ground to satisfy a housing need. Now it becomes more targeted than for the woman who spoke earlier about 150 to 200,000 being the price range. Getting various partnerships, giving them the ability to participate and become part of a much bigger housing development initiative. And I know there's been a lot of good programs that have come out lately, through NIFA, and then what folks at Greater Fremont Development Council have done as well, that are helping to make the community competitive for all housing types, especially as it relates to affordable housing, and especially for, understanding the difference between low income housing and affordable housing, because affordable housing, covers all of the populations. It's just a matter of what their incomes give them the ability to do, rather than, low income housing, which you have your ceiling for income, and there's no more, there's nobody above that can live there. So, it's just understanding the difference between low income housing and affordable housing too. But yeah, that was just a couple of thoughts I wanted to throw in on there as well.
I want to address that previous issue a little bit. I'm just kind of crunching some numbers here. I would just estimate in the city of Fremont that you have close to around 235 to 265 housing units that are off the market. They're basically not available to rent or to purchase. Now, some of those can be single family homes. I could crunch the numbers a little harder to kind of figure that out. Some of those are single family homes. Some of those are just, followed through the census process as it relates to like units downtown that were once, occupied as rental units and now they're not, so on and so forth. But, you probably have at least 150 single family homes sitting there and basically doing nothing. They're not for sale or rent. And these are the kind of things I think that you should target when you have your housing initiative to secure property through a land bank or whatever the process you want to use. I think these are the kind of units you ought to target and get out there and get them bought. Now, you need a bankroll to do that. And this is where you go to your local foundations, go to some statewide foundations that are willing to help out, go to your major employers to put some money in the bucket. So you need a bankroll to go out there and be able to, talk the talk, walk the walk kind of thing. And so, but so you're going to have money to do that. It kind of comes down to like the answer is money. What's the question? So it's like, you need money to be able to do that type of thing. So you should set a goal, that particular housing development initiative in regards to picking up some of these units that are neither for sale or rent. You should set a goal over the next 5 years to pick up 100 of them or 75 of them and either rehab them and make them available at a very reasonable price to either, you want to sell them, you don't want to own them, and you want to be a landlord, to get those sold to families, and then, or either tear them down and make the lots available for them and give them a free lot to build a house on. So anyway, I'll continue to crunch those numbers. That's just kind of, just kind of crunching some numbers here I have from the county assessor and from the census.
Just a little point I've been thinking, I reiterate kind of what Jamie said there, as well as what we've all said, is there's so many levels of housing, and being a single parent family, my income is still in the lower range, so my options to buy are very low. My question is kind of, we know there's these properties that are empty, not being used or dilapidated, but are still not being available. Even if we had that money bank, how do we go about, is that a city issue? How do we go about pressing some of those to get those either demoed and out or rehabbed?
Typically, it favors your effort to have some kind of nonprofit entity, a 501c3, because who knows, somebody might say, I'll tell you what, you give me a tax write-off, I'll give it to you. It's that type of thing. And as soon as they give it to you, you probably have more of a liability than an asset. So you have to be prepared to do something with it. I'm trying to remember what was your question exactly? Oh, and go ahead.
Basically just how do we, because for instance, I know there's many red tagged homes and they don't get, we can't exactly push those out. Wondering where we go with that.
The landlords that we talk about, something that was brought up earlier, the landlords typically don't chase the red tags, okay? They just won't do that. because it's just too much headache involved. But you have to have start with a nonprofit 501c. There has to be one of the organizations in the community to take on that purchase property land bank deal. And from there, they can secure different dollars as well as give tax breaks for the benefit of it. But what you have to do is just contact them. Contact them. And I own an older home in Lincoln, and I constantly get these postcards from these flippers who want to buy the house, and I don't know why, but I don't know why they even bother me with it, because I toss them in the garbage. But there are these flippers that want to buy the house and fix them up and resell them and make money. I mean, that's their business. They're flippers. But you kind of have to sort of be your own flipper kind of thing as it relates to this, and be competitive for the dollars. Now, one thing the flippers can't do, they can't give property tax. They can't give, tax write-offs, and a nonprofit 501c3 could do that. That's one of the benefits you have of having that organization. And so oftentimes you put yourself in competition with the private sector. And that's okay. I mean, it's just the nature of it, because you're willing to do things that they're not willing to do. Private sector does a great job, but there's limitations as it relates to what their rate of return is on their investment. And that's where you have to step in as a nonprofit organization. So.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay. Hi, my name is Blair Horner. I'm a realtor here in Fremont. When I hear you guys talking about empty or derelict or rundown housing, et cetera, yeah, I know it's out there, but there's going to be a multitude of reasons for that. I think you're going to run into some problems trying to compel people to sell something they don't want to sell. But then the other thing too that I think you got to be a little cognizant of, and I'm sure you guys have, you all seem like pretty smart people. Red tag, when I hear those, I get a little nervous about them as a realtor, simply because of where a lot of those sit. And a lot of those red tags may still exist from March 2019. And if you talk about taking those properties over and then putting somebody in it that may be financially strapped, that brings a whole lot of other multitude of issues with it, right? I mean, flood insurance, everything else. So, when you're talking about those, I think you got to be really careful. And I don't think that's the answer to your question at all, or to the problem at all. Could be a small part of it, but I don't think it's, I think when you're focusing on this, it has to be a way to develop better housing that's going to fit the needs. Don Peterson has attempted to do some of that at Sunridge Place, but lumber prices are going up, for example, something we can't control. Builders are now having a little bit of trouble trying to hit the price points that we're trying to target. And it's not that we can't get the job done, but there's a lot of moving parts to this thing that just, it's fun to sit around and talk about it, but we've got to figure that piece out so that folks like Jamie have a shot at getting a house. That's, and I would hate to see somebody like Jamie's only option to be a red tag property. That would be a shame. That's all I got to say.
Well, good point. Thank you. I appreciate that. And, again, it's helpful to have dollars in pockets to do things. Down payment assistance, is beneficial. You're more competitive if you have down payment assistance, 20% for a house. A lot of times when folks get beat out of buying a house, they get beat out with someone that's not willing to put as much money down. They're going to pay more, but they're going to only put 5 or 10% down. So the more money that you have in your pocket for down payment assistance also makes you very competitive. And so some of the workforce dollars can be utilized for that type of thing. And if we get the workforce dollars, blended with the major employers and their employees, and then with an organization like the economic development or a nonprofit group, then you can be pretty competitive to get some units bought. We're talking about, habitable units, not red tag units. But So I wanted to bring that point up as well. Other comments? Appreciate it. Good stuff. Where are we at time-wise? We have to leave. All right. Hey, thanks a lot, everybody. We're going to let you go. Keith's going to tune in on the Scrivener one. I got to run a different function. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. We'll have our meeting next week. I'm going to crunch some more numbers, have some more tables sent out. So have a wonderful Labor Day weekend. That ought to be fun. Don't forget to work on Labor Day weekend. All right. See you later.